And there's a lot of value to be offered from people that have a different perspective and a different point of view. And that perspective and point of view brings out a holistic approach.
Welcome to Trial to Triumph, hosted by Caleb Johnson, the show about leaning into life's constant testing on your way to realizing your biggest blessings.
How's it going, everyone? My name is Caleb Johnson, host of From Trial to Triumph. This is a show where I speak with guests who have gone through tremendous trials and they have come out triumphant. And even if you have not experienced what our guests have experienced personally, there are always learning lessons from every trial. So something will be able to speak to you, and I will do my best to kind of bring those into sight. So without further ado, today we have David Mcllwaine, and I'm really excited to speak to David today. So David, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here, Caleb. And it's Mcllwaine, just as an FYI. It's hard to pronounce, and everybody fumbles through it. So there's an A that doesn't exist.
Okay, I got that. I'll take that to note. Mcllwaine, I got you.
Yeah.
And David, can you just tell our listeners, I know a little bit about your story, but I would really, like to give you the opportunity to tell our listeners just kind of, what you came from and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Oklahoma in the 70s and 80s in Tulsa and went to school at the University of Kansas, proud member of Jayhawk Nation. Then went to work in corporate America, had a really good career in the advertising business. Was in that business selling advertising and marketing solutions for 25 years. Had a midlife hiccup, you might say. In the course of 12 months, I lost my career and I lost my marriage and my family. Went through a really nasty divorce. Ended up in the tech world for a couple of years and then got to real estate. Kind of a circuitous path, but here I am, general partner in about 1,000 multifamily doors and a long-time syndicator now. 3 years, is that a long time? I don't know. Maybe it is.
Can you, for the listeners that don't know what GP is or syndicator, can you kind of just give a quick little description of what those are?
Yeah, so great question. Thanks for getting me out of my vocabulary. A GP is a general partner, and a syndicator is a person who puts together a series of limited partners or investors. They commingle funds. They go out and as an organization, as a newly formed LLC or company, they buy an asset. And then the general partners operate the asset. The limited partners, or sometimes known as passive investors, capitalize or invest in the process and then let the general partners run and operate the business as they see fit. Think of it as analogous to buying a share of Apple stock. You own part of the company. You get to vote in some things, but you don't control what product is launched, and you don't get a say in what color your iPhone that they manufacture is. You get a color of what iPhone you get to pick as a consumer, much like a renter gets to pick what property they're going to rent it. So that's what I do. I put together people and we buy businesses. The businesses we buy are apartment complexes. It's not very complex, but people really do make it that way.
Yeah, you really simplified it there, and I've never heard of anyone explain it like an Apple, iPhone. But you described that flawlessly, and I might actually steal that from you down the road because that's what I do as well.
Just give me credit.
But kind of just want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned in that 12-month span of time, your life was really turned upside down. So can you, explain a little bit what got you to that point maybe?
Well, I've been a corporate executive, and I was one of 7 people in a leadership position going through a merger. And we had been in this merger for about 18 months. The Department of Justice had slowed the merger, and the 7 of us had been operating our different structures within the company, waiting for approval for the new parents to buy the company. We knew when the company was going to be bought that we would lose our jobs. So it was kind of a strange position. The Department of Justice approved the merger, and 6 months later, we were all let go on the same day or the day after we let everybody go. And from there, My marriage was not doing well, and it fell apart. So in the course of losing my career, because I was in a very niche field, and there were two companies in the country doing what we did. One bought the other. So the guy that just bought me just fired me or laid me off or griffed me, however you want to language it. And I was in Denver, Colorado, selling advertising on a national footprint. And for those that don't know, Denver, Colorado is not what you would call the advertising media sales mecca. You got to be in New York, Chicago, LA, Dallas, Atlanta. Not really in Denver. So my career fell apart and my marriage fell apart. So I quickly found myself facing single dadhood. And while in the advertising and marketing world, I lived on an airplane. I was in a different city every day, 3 or 4 days a week, 3 weeks of the month, had 50 nights in one hotel group and 50 nights in another hotel group in the same year. I was gone a lot. I had a territory that covered 24 states, and I very much believe you had to be in front of your people to lead your people. Right or wrong, it was pre-Zoom, and video conferencing wasn't a thing. So it all came crashing down.
Like you said, you living in an airport, that's got to be stressful. I mean, on you. And have you changed your leadership philosophy now to kind of, instead of maybe being in front of your people, maybe that's kind of shifted a little bit?
Well, I think it's shifting a lot. First and foremost, I don't have a staff of 35 in 24 states, so I don't have that kind of leadership requirement. Second, I always believe that you could lead from the front, and leading from the front now is very different. COVID changed the world, and for the better in a lot of ways, and for the worse in some other ways. For the better in that it accelerated the digital revolution of video conferencing. It accelerated the way that we are looking at work as an extension of ourselves, as opposed to being just a vehicle to work. We can have work be part of our life. You know, I started working before the fax machine was prevalent. And so for a lot of listeners, I'm sure they'd never concepted not having a cell phone. And when we first got cell phones, they were bricks. And it was tremendously freeing because you can make a phone call from a car and you didn't waste your commute time. But it was really expensive. And then eventually we got to adoption, and you got to the tipping point, and it became a norm, and then it became okay to call somebody on a cell phone. Initially, you couldn't call somebody on a cell phone because it was burning their minutes up and they were irritated. This video conferencing is going through the same evolution. And that changes the way we lead. We lead now with more content than we do with more one-on-one. We lead now with more emotional vulnerability than we ever did in the past 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I would have never had this conversation because it wasn't quote-unquote professional. So there's a lot of things that have evolved through that for sure. And I think for the better in a lot of ways. The negative, to sound like a curmudgeon for a second, is that people have forgotten how to look through the eye. They don't know how to have a kind of a dialogue. I was at a table in New York this week at a conference where there were 6 strangers sitting there. We were all trying to meet each other. And one of the 6 of us had his phone in his hand and wouldn't look up. And I don't know what his purpose was in doing that. I still don't know why he was at the conference. But that's just a cultural change.
What was one of those biggest takeaways from a learning lesson from, I mean, leading, maybe 15, 20 years ago, and it's funny, the whole cell phone brick, that's amazing. Just how far we've come. And
right, it really is.
How do you lead now compared to back then?
It's a lot more questions. And the questions are a lot more around, what do you think? And back then there was a lot more dictation. This is the way we're going to do it. There's a lot more interaction between people. Now when I talk with an asset property manager or I talk with someone on my team, I'm going to ask for their feedback. And prior, I didn't care what their feedback was. I was the boss. And the communication channels have definitely changed. And you don't get on a Zoom call and tell somebody what to do and expect them to do it any longer. The generations below me, which have been very forward thinking, want voice. And there's a lot of value to be offered from people that have a different perspective and a different point of view. And that perspective and point of view brings out a holistic approach to something. I used to say I can't fix a problem if I don't know what the problem is. And now I say I can't fix a problem if I don't know what the problem is, and we don't all put our heads together.
You know, I heard a story about Google, and they actually pay their employees to have downtime where they think of potential opportunities, kind of like that. And it's very, very similar. And I used to actually have the belief of, you know, let's say you're at a restaurant and you're asking the waitress, hey, what's your favorite food? And you start asking, you know, these questions and the questions and questions. And thinking about that back in the day, that might actually make me uncomfortable, asking a lot of questions. But now, you know, the more successful people I hang around and the more successful people I see, the most successful person seems to ask the most questions. That's what I've seen. And, you know, I just love what you said, is that they always ask questions and they want to learn from other people what their thoughts are, right? Because we don't all know everything. And that's really opened the door for many businesses.
Yeah, and if you think about it, an executive's job is to get the best out of the organization. And to get the best out of the organization is to get all of the organization's resources to be heard, to be addressed, and to be driven. I actually went through a series of interviews at Google, and I didn't get the job, and it was in 2004 or 2008, 2006. And when I spent a day on campus going through their process, they talked a lot about that 10% requirement. And they used to challenge, I imagine they probably still do, they would challenge all their employees to do 10% of their work around a passion project. And that's what inspired about 15 different businesses with the Alphabet parent. And that's why Alphabet is now there, is because Google search was its business. And one of those passions became Gmail. One of those passions became Google Chat. One of those passions became AdSense. So a lot of those things came out of letting their employees follow some interest while being paid. And obviously Google's an outlier. They've got tremendous resource and they've had an amazing run. So it goes back to that culture of transparency and letting people add value where they can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, David, you mentioned earlier that being a single dad really changed your perspective on priorities, and going through that 12-month process of losing 2/3 of your net worth changed your priorities.
When I was growing up, I was given a series of ethics and morals. And my father was in the military, and my grandfather was in the military, and I had a Judeo-Christian upbringing in Oklahoma. And the morals were pretty well defined. But the reality is that during that upheaval, I had to reset my ethics and my morals. And if you're going to live in your ethics and morals, you have to pick them and own them. And the you is the collective you, not you, Caleb, obviously, or you, the listener. Someone has to own their morals. And own them is take authorship of them and their ethics. And so how I live in it now is I had to sit down and consciously decide what was valuable to me over my priorities and what was not. And the interesting thing is that my first priority initially was to be a provider and to become wealthy. And then when I lost my career in media sales and my net worth disappeared in divorce, and I had to learn a new world as a single dad. And, you know, this is not something that just a few people go through. Half of marriages end in divorce, tragically, which means that this is a situation happening day in and day out. And I can't tell you the number of fathers I've talked to that say, I had to give up, or I had to walk away from, or I tried to hire a nanny to do A, B, and C. And I was faced with the choice of, Do I continue to pursue economics and money, or do I become a father? And my kids were 8 and 9 at the time, and I chose to become a dad. And it's far more valuable to me than the economic gains I made were I working 60 hours a week and trying to continue to climb corporate ladder.
For someone who is going through, maybe they have a lack of motivation, or they know they need to change something, and you, when speaking about your priorities now, and that being your kids, you understand that is your priority. And if you had to communicate to someone else, how they should define their priorities, what would you say to that person?
I'd say you've really got to sit down and isolate what's important to you. And I've read that quote 1,000 times. No one's going to say, gee, I wished I worked more on my deathbed. And so what I was faced with was I had enough economic resource, fortunately, from my career in media sales to not have to worry every single day about paying the mortgage. I had to make money and I had to pay the mortgage, but I had to also balance all this. So I decided that the most important thing to me was my father defined success as being friends with his adult children. I thought that was a really interesting definition of success. I processed this for a long time, and I decided that was a goal I had. And my kids are now in college, and so I'm no longer a day-to-day single dad. And one of them is going to school in Scotland, and one of them is going to school in New Jersey, and I live in Denver. So we don't have conversations nonstop, but we can communicate. And that's because I built a relationship that was open and transparent and directional in nature. So I had to decide that my value was going to be, I want to guide them and teach them. And what was I going to do to show them my principles? And that all led to the same thing. So if the principle was, I'm going to be transparent, I have to tell them what's happening in my world. If my principle was, I'm going to be honest, I got to tell them when they hurt my feelings, and when I hurt their feelings, I have to apologize. If my principle was that you have to work hard, I had to show them how I would work hard. And working hard is not hours. And so I would bring them into my businesses. I would bring them into what I was doing. I would have them helping me do labor around the house. It depended on what the premise was to make sure that the lesson I wanted conveyed was done by action far more than words. Does that answer the question? Or am I just kind of blabbering?
Yeah. No, that did. You said some really amazing things there about, oh, wow. Well, I want to touch on what your father said.
Is it?
How he defined success. And that was if he wanted to have a friendship with his children. And I've heard, I want to kind of define that a little bit, because I've heard several people at a certain age that's appropriate, and at another age it might not be the best for the children to kind of have discipline and things like that. So at what kind of point, what kind of point do you start building that friendship, and how do you kind of get to the finish line?
You missed a key word in that. I want to be in a friend with my adult children.
There you go. Uh-huh.
The adult children. So my children are now on the precipice of adulthood. So the dialogues I have today are around decision-making and processes. For example, my daughter recently procrastinated on something, and she was supposed to go to college on day X, and the car she was having repaired wasn't ready until X minus a day. So she had to sit and wait and get to college a day later than she wanted to, because the car wasn't ready, and the car wasn't ready because she hadn't taken it to the mechanic like I told her to 2 months ago. So the parenting side is you procrastinated, and this is the cause and effect of consequences of the real world. And the friend side is it sucks that you're going to have to stay an extra day here as opposed to going back to college and being with your friends. Yeah, when the kid's 11, 12, you're not going to be their friend. You're going to be their dad. And their dad teaches them lessons and gives them support. But if you do that consistently over time and you're a safe place, they come to you. And that's where the friendship becomes valuable as they come to share who they are. And you get to respect and appreciate them as the humans they are, not as a human being you want them to be.
Man, forgive my pause, but that is just so profound. And I can tell that you obviously have a real love for your children, and going through that as a single dad has really, really made you the man who you are. And that's obviously really impacted you.
Right. And my kids now will talk calmly about problems and wins. And they ask for guidance. So when I have a problem, I call my dad, who's in his 80s. And I could say, Dad, here are the issues. What do you think? And we can have a real conversation about it, and we can see the pros and the cons, and I get feedback. And so my kids have that same relationship, and that's an invaluable resource, right? And you get that by parenting to value.
And David, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. If not everyone has a parent, I think it's amazing that you still have the opportunity to speak with your dad, and I've been really blessed to have a good relationship with my father where, he has been that person where I can bounce things off, and, whenever I'm going through something challenging, he's one of the first people I call. And I know that is such a blessing that I have a dad like that. Now, if someone is listening to this and they don't have a relationship with someone like that in their life, what do you say to those people?
Get a mentor. How do you do that is the next question, right? And the way you do that is by finding somebody who exhibits traits that you respect and starting a conversation. And then be yourself. So I have many mentors in my world. I have some mentors that were professionals, former bosses. I have some mentors that are actually friends of mine that are peers that I think of as mentors on certain categories where they have strengths. I have professional mentors that I've never met that I read their writing, or I follow what they do on social media from a content perspective. A couple of guys in the multifamily space that I really respect. I met one of them this week, and I watch what he does, and I learn from it. One of my hobbies is to be a lifelong learner. And the way you become a lifelong learner is by having questions and curiosity. And mentors give you a sounding board. Friends. One of my best friend's dads was a great source for me growing up. He's a mentor, and he's in his 80s, and if I call him today, we could have a 4-hour conversation. I don't do that because I don't have a question for him today, but those people in your lives are valuable. And I think the way to do that is through that structure. The other way is to join an organization, volunteer, and to be amazed at what you meet. I met all kinds. I used to be in the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Denver's structures, and I met fabulous, wonderful people, and I made great relationships with them. And some were peers, some were mentors, some were mentees in some ways.
David, you said a mentee, and finding someone, if maybe, it's on your heart to be a mentor and you want to mentee someone, and you've obviously gone through that yourself, how do you, if you want to find someone that can be a good mentee, and this actually is a good question, if someone wants to get mentored, this is good to know what a mentor is looking for in a mentee, because you can be that person, right? And so the question I have for you, David, is if you want to find a mentee and someone to kind of pour into, maybe help educate, how do you find a person to really spend your time on?
It's an interesting question. I was thinking about it from the converse of that. If you want to find a mentor, how do you convince them to give you their time? And it's the same answer. It is that you have to let the universe, your higher power, your God, your whatever it may be, your faith, tradition, space and time to connect you with people. I've got a friend of mine that I met during this tumultuous time that I was actually thinking of getting on a plane and going to and say, I need to learn from you X. Will you teach it to me? And I'm interviewing a person right now to possibly create a partnership. And his question to me was, what do you need? And I said, I need a mentor for X. I know A, B, C through L, but I don't know M, N, O, and P. Great. I need somebody who can teach me M, N, O, and P, or my weakness is Z. And I think having self-awareness is a part of that, finding them. And then if you're looking for a mentee, the volunteering's great. Depends on what category it's going to be in, whether it's professional, personal, spiritual, physical. You go to a gym, your gym coach is a mentor. You go to volunteer, and the people you're helping might be the mentees. And there are plenty of structured organizations, obviously in the youth world, picking big brothers, big sisters, boys and girls clubs, Boy Scouts of America, Girl Scouts of America, all of those types of organizations, a lot of youth stuff like that. Professionally, a lot of companies have those structures. I find that I can create relationships with people in real estate meetups. I was talking to a woman earlier this week in New York who was 2 years behind me. So does she have information that I could use? Yes. And do I have information she can use? Absolutely. And is it wise to share it? 110%. Come from a place of abundance, and sharing is much more warmly received than a place of secrecy and silence.
Absolutely. And what I want all the listeners to understand from what David just said, something that I took away from that was, if you want to be mentored, or if you want to find a mentee, like David said, you need to go to, let's say, a Boys and Girls Club, or you need to go to XYZ event. You still need to put it out into the universe and say, hey, this is what I want. I want XYZ, because I guarantee you, if I want to learn Spanish and I keep that to myself and I never act on it, and I never, go to Mexico, or I never go on a platform that has Spanish teachers, I will never learn Spanish. So if you want to learn something, if you want to have a mentor, or maybe if you want to find a mentee, you need to actually put that out in the universe, and it'll amaze you what opportunities come about just by putting it out there.
Yeah. And I'm not the manifestation kind of guy, but I'm the take action guy. So, okay, I'm going to put it out there that this goal I have. I've got a series of goals on my wall I can see behind the screen. And so the question is, what am I doing to go forward from that goal? You don't just find a mentor by saying, I want a mentor. You say, I want a mentor, and I'm going to go to these 5 things looking for people that I can emulate.
So, David, I think we'll have to start winding this down, but I want to go ahead and ask you 3 quick questions.
Yeah.
And before I even ask those, I really enjoyed speaking to you. You are obviously just a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate your time being on here today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, and we don't really talk about business much, but I try to take these philosophies into business so that there's value exchange. And it's everything we've talked about today is really a value exchange. You give and you get equally, and that's where
Right.
things are beneficial.
So, David, those final 3 questions. The first one would be, if you can recommend a book to our listeners, what would that be?
Well, I'm going to go with a book called The 4 Agreements by I can never remember if I got to look it up. Don Miguel Ruiz. It's an ancient Toltec thing, and the 4 agreements basically are ways to work through principles. And these are some of my principles. And the 4 agreements are be impeccable with your word. Do not take things personally. Make no assumptions, and always do your best. And then it goes in dialogues and all those things, but it's kind of a how do you approach life question thing. I've really got a lot out of it over the years, and I've read it several times. And I don't always remember all 4 agreements in time, but I go through them.
I've actually never heard of that book, but just the way you described it, all those things are so key, and I need to go download that book right now and read it myself.
The way to get a hold of me is macassets.com. That's MAC assets, ASSETS.com.
And I'll put that information in the show notes as well, so people can reach you there. And the final question, David, would be if you could share one takeaway from today's show with our listeners, what would that be?
Always get up and live in your values.
Simple, man. Always persevere and just stand in your values. I mean, you can't really go wrong with that. So, wow, David, again, really just want to appreciate your time. Just say I appreciate your time being on the show and speaking to you. I hope some of that knowledge that you shared today about parenting and mentors and being a mentee will actually rub off on me. So, really appreciate you being on today.
My pleasure, Caleb. Thanks for having me, and hopefully your listeners got something out of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time. Have a good day.
It's time to grab your victory. Find us on the web at redseacapitalgroup.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Red Sea Capital Group.